The shoreline of Leyte was deceptively calm that morning. Japanese officers stationed near the southern perimeter had grown used to the drone of Allied aircraft passing overhead. But today, something was different. The pattern was too tight, the engine hum too low. They stepped out of their bunkers and stared at the sky, scanning for silhouettes. What they saw didn't make sense at first. Dark specks falling, but no chutes opening yet. Within seconds, olive-drab canopies snapped open across the sky. Paratroopers, dozens of them, then hundreds. It was the 11th Airborne Division, and they were dropping far closer to the front than anyone had expected. There was no naval bombardment, no long artillery prep, just boots and rifles falling from the sky like steel rain. The Japanese rushed to mobilize. Officers shouted orders from dugouts, signaling nearby machine gun teams to reposition. They expected resistance to be chaotic. What they didn't expect was what those paratroopers were holding in their hands. Small, compact rifles, too short to be standard. Some even looked broken. "Did they land with pistols?" one lieutenant reportedly asked in confusion. But those pistols weren't sidearms. They were M1A1 Carbines, folding stock variants designed specifically for airborne troops. While heavier infantry units carried the longer M1 Garand, these carbines were lighter, faster, and deadly in close quarters. The folding stock allowed paratroopers to carry them tight against the chest during the drop, unfolding them mid-motion as soon as they hit the ground. By the time the Japanese machine gunners opened fire, it was already too late. The Americans were up, spread out, and returning fire with pinpoint accuracy. One Japanese position was overrun in under 6 minutes. Reports from surviving defenders claimed they were overwhelmed before they could even identify what was happening. The M1A1's .30 caliber rounds tore through foliage and sandbag alike. Unlike the heavier Garand, these rifles allowed for faster follow-up shots and greater mobility in the jungle terrain. Japanese soldiers had been trained to exploit reload windows. With the carbine, there were almost none. Entire positions were silenced before the defenders could reload their Arisaka rifles. To Japanese officers watching through binoculars from rear positions, the scene looked wrong, like something from another war. Troops moving in small squads, weapons shouldered and firing while advancing, stocks that folded like tools and unfolded into death. It was a level of flexibility and fluidity they hadn't expected from American infantry. One Japanese captain, writing in his personal notebook, later recovered from the battlefield, wrote, "They carried rifles that bent like knives. Then they cut us down with them." The psychological effect was immediate. Panic set in. If the enemy had weapons that collapsed and reassembled mid-battle, what else were they hiding? By the end of the first hour, the paratroopers had established a forward perimeter. 5 machine gun nests had been captured. Communications trenches were cleared with grenades and burst fire. The Americans hadn't just landed, they had embedded themselves like steel into the jungle floor. The standard-issue rifle for most Japanese infantrymen was the Arisaka Type 99. It was long, bolt-action, and designed for accuracy, not speed. In training manuals, soldiers were taught to fire methodically, conserve ammo, and strike from distance. But that doctrine was built around engagements against similarly slow-firing enemies. The Americans were using something else, something faster, something terrifying. The M1A1 Carbine wasn't just lighter, it was a different class of weapon. Weighing just over 5 pounds and featuring a folding wire stock, it could be deployed and fired in under 2 seconds after landing. For paratroopers, that made the difference between life and death, and for the Japanese, it meant they were under fire before they even spotted the enemy. In multiple accounts recovered from Japanese officers, there were reports of rifles unfolding in motion, American soldiers firing while running, and no time to return fire. What they were facing wasn't just a rifle, it was a shock delivery system. Combined with grenades, bayonets, and sheer momentum, the M1A1 Carbine became a brutal tool of first contact. One bunker crew in southern Leyte described the firefight as being swarmed by wasps. Short bursts of semi-automatic fire came from multiple directions. The Arisaka rifle, with its bolt-action mechanism, was outclassed immediately. Some Japanese soldiers tried to close distance for hand-to-hand combat, only to be dropped mid-charge by rapid shots to the torso. Even the officers were stunned. These weren't just elite units, they were aggressive, mobile, and used terrain like jungle fighters. Japanese doctrine relied on identifying American movements before contact, but with these paratroopers, contact was the first sign of movement. The folding stock was more than a gimmick. It changed how the weapon was carried, deployed, and used. Paratroopers dropped with it secured against their chest. Upon landing, a twist of the wrist unfolded the stock, locked it in place, and allowed immediate firing. No unpacking, no assembly, no time wasted. A Japanese sergeant major, interviewed years after the war, said, "We believed their rifles would break from the landing. Instead, they were shooting before we even found our footing." The weapon became part of the psychology. Its sound, its size, its speed, nothing about it fit the Japanese image of how an American soldier fought. Captured M1A1s were quickly sent up the chain of command. Photographs were taken, field reports written. Japanese engineers examined them and were reportedly impressed by the simplicity and strength of the locking mechanism. Too practical to copy quickly, one report concluded. Their tactics are evolving. Back in the field, however, there was no time for analysis. Japanese soldiers were dying in defensive tunnels, dugouts, and camouflaged foxholes, overrun by fast-moving squads who never stopped to reload like their predecessors had. The battlefield rhythm had changed. Bolt-action pauses were gone. Now it was continuous motion, continuous fire. By the end of the second day, Japanese defenders began to abandon static positions. Entire trenches were left behind in favor of deeper, forested retreat paths. But it was too late. The Americans were already there with folding carbines in hand and no intention of slowing down. By the third day of contact, Japanese command posts were in chaos. Messages from forward units were inconsistent. Some described mass landings, others insisted it was only reconnaissance. But one phrase kept repeating: the fast rifle. It wasn't just the M1A1's folding stock or light weight, it was how it was used. The Americans weren't spraying bullets, they were aiming. Calculated, efficient, and it was terrifying. Fire discipline among U.S. paratroopers was drilled to near perfection. Each man was responsible for his own rate of fire, conserving ammo, and covering sectors in small squad formations. Japanese observers noted that American riflemen rarely fired in panic. When they pulled the trigger, someone fell. In contrast, Japanese infantry, trained for bayonet charges and group maneuvers, relied heavily on massed action. The bolt-action Arisaka could not compete with the rhythm of the carbines. Even when Japanese units outnumbered their attackers, the Americans won because they fired first and they fired smart. One Japanese lieutenant tried to flank an American squad holding a ridge near Burawan. His men crawled under foliage, preparing a left-side assault. Before they got within 20 meters, two sharp bursts echoed from the brush line. The lieutenant fell. So did 3 of his men. The rest scattered. No shouting, no movement, just silence, and then death. The Americans weren't holding ground. They were pushing it forward, meter by meter, and they were doing it with speed. The M1A1's quick cycling action meant fewer pauses, fewer reloads, fewer vulnerabilities. Japanese machine gun nests that would normally pin down attackers were being flanked and destroyed within minutes. More alarming were reports of Americans advancing without heavy support. No tanks, no artillery, just airborne troops and carbines. It shattered Japanese assumptions. They had believed U.S. forces were dependent on armor and bombing runs. Now they were losing ground to what looked like infantry alone. Captured Japanese diaries revealed another recurring word: ghosts. One soldier wrote, "They are fast, silent, and the jungle hides them. By the time you hear the weapon, it's already too late." Fear spread not just among foot soldiers, but up the command chain. These weren't Marines or naval troops. They were something else. The folding stock had another unintended psychological effect. When seen closed, the weapon appeared almost toy-like, thin, weak. But in combat, that illusion vanished. Officers misjudged firepower and range, assuming shorter meant lighter. In truth, the M1A1's effective range and stopping power were more than enough for jungle combat. Even when Japanese forces did capture or retrieve an M1A1 from a fallen American, they rarely used it. Ammunition was incompatible with their supply lines, and the unfamiliar mechanism confused most conscripts. The weapon remained an icon of American adaptability and Japanese frustration. By the end of the week, Japanese forward units stopped engaging altogether in some sectors. Instead, they laid traps, pulled back, and hoped for terrain to slow the Americans. But nothing slowed them. The sound of the M1A1 opening and firing became a symbol of collapse, fast, mechanical, and merciless. By mid-November 1944, Japanese forward command structures in Leyte began to fragment. The shock of the airborne landings, combined with the unfamiliar weapons and tactics, had eroded morale faster than any artillery barrage could. Officers stopped giving direct counterattack orders. Instead, they urged withdrawal, reorganization, and delay, stalling for time that didn't exist. What unsettled them most was the lack of predictability. American forces weren't behaving the way Japanese command had been taught. There was no rigid line, no formation to break. Instead, small squads moved fluidly, communicating with hand signals, advancing behind cover, never staying in one place long enough to be pinned down. The M1A1 Carbine was central to this flexibility. Its light weight allowed soldiers to move fast, faster than Japanese units could track or reposition. The folding stock gave them the edge in mobility, especially during low crawl movements and tight quarters. Firepower didn't just follow the troops, it led them. At night, the sound of the carbine firing in the jungle became a psychological weapon of its own. A quick, rhythmic sequence of cracks echoing through the trees signaled not just gunfire, but the advance of an enemy that never seemed to sleep. Japanese troops began reporting phantom engagements, firing at shadows, reacting to sounds. The line between real contact and fear blurred. In one captured after-action report, a Japanese unit described a night raid by American paratroopers who appeared from the tree line, silent and crouched, firing before standing. The raid was over in minutes. 8 Japanese were dead. The Americans vanished into the dark. No bodies, no equipment, only spent casings and footprints. The tactical doctrine that had once made Japanese infantry so formidable, discipline, bayonet charges, fixed positions, was now obsolete. In the jungle, against fast-moving, well-armed squads, it was a death sentence. Some commanders began ordering the abandonment of outer bunkers altogether, relocating further inland where terrain favored defense. But even there, safety was temporary. The paratroopers followed. They cut through dense brush, climbed ridges, and flanked hillsides with speed and precision. One radio operator reported hearing gunfire above before realizing the Americans had scaled a cliff and were firing down into trenches. The folding stock wasn't just a design feature, it was the symbol of an army built for motion. Japanese rifles were strong, yes, but they belonged to a different era. The M1A1 Carbine belonged to the fight that was actually happening, and it was winning. In Tokyo, High Command began receiving fragmentary reports of these engagements. The weapons were noted. So was the psychological effect. One classified cable remarked, "The enemy fielding rifles unlike ours. Morale is weakened. Units report confusion." That single sentence summarized an entire frontline reality collapsing. American forces didn't need overwhelming numbers or tanks in this battle. They had something more dangerous: momentum, mobility, and a rifle that could unfold as fast as the war was unraveling for Japan. By the second week of the Leyte campaign, Japanese commanders began ordering urgent weapons reviews. Recovered M1A1 carbines were dismantled, sketched, and analyzed. Engineers at rear command posts scrambled to understand how such a light weapon could perform so efficiently in jungle warfare. Their conclusion was simple and devastating: too effective to counter with existing doctrine. Attempts were made to replicate the tactical advantages. Units were instructed to break into smaller teams. Movement drills were revised. But the changes were coming from desperation, not innovation. Japanese officers weren't adapting, they were reacting. The Americans had written a new rule book, and every chapter began with mobility. In at least 2 confirmed cases, Japanese infantry tried to mimic the American approach using Type 100 submachine guns. But they had limited range, heavier weight, and suffered constant jamming in humid environments. Meanwhile, The M1A1 Carbine was cycling without fail, feeding from 15-round box magazines that reloaded faster and jammed less. One Japanese soldier, captured weeks later and interrogated by U.S. intelligence, described his unit's attempt to engage in hit-and-run tactics with their own rifles. He ran forward, fired once, and ducked. They ran forward, fired 10 times, and didn't stop. The disparity was more than mechanical, it was philosophical. The Americans trusted their individual soldiers to think fast and act alone if needed. The Japanese still relied on centralized orders, even at the squad level. In a jungle where visibility dropped to 10 meters and lines dissolved, that delay was fatal. The folding stock carbine wasn't just a tool, it was an enabler of decentralized warfare. By now, Japanese morale was hemorrhaging. Units began refusing to reinforce positions known to be attacked by paratroopers. "They move like wind," one field commander reported. "We shoot into the trees shoot back." Even veteran units that had fought the British in Burma were rattled by the speed and autonomy of these Americans. As Japanese artillery and mortar crews tried to regroup, they faced another problem: targeting. With no fixed lines to shell, and with American units appearing and disappearing like ghosts, their fire missions became guesswork. One 75mm gun crew reportedly fired an entire crate of shells into empty forest. 20 minutes later, they were overrun. In some cases, Japanese soldiers abandoned rifles altogether in favor of grenades and blades, trying to close distance at all costs. It was a suicidal tactic. The carbines didn't flinch. At close range, they emptied magazines in seconds. Survivors described entire charges dissolving under a curtain of short-range fire. The folding stock continued to baffle observers. Its simple hinge-and-lock design seemed too basic to explain the tactical shift it enabled. And yet, time and time again, it proved itself not with theory, but with body counts. Officers who once laughed at its appearance now treated it as a symbol of American dominance in the jungle. By the end of November, Japanese high command had all but abandoned hope of holding Leyte. The official orders were to delay, harass, and die slowly. But many lower-ranking officers knew the truth. The battle had been lost not with bombs, but with a rifle that folded in half and didn't stop firing. News of the folding carbine spread beyond the battlefield. American war correspondents, embedded with the 11th Airborne Division, began writing about the compact rifles their boys were carrying. Shorter, lighter, and faster. Photographs of the M1A1 with its wire stock folded against the receiver began appearing in U.S. newspapers. Civilians thought it looked strange. Troops thought it looked like the future. For the American infantryman, the M1A1 became a badge of identity. It was issued to paratroopers, glider infantry, and officers who needed firepower without the weight of a full-length rifle. It was the opposite of what the Japanese expected, a weapon made not for slow, deliberate fighting, but for movement. And that movement was relentless. In Manila, surviving Japanese officers prepared their next defensive line while requesting additional reinforcements. But they also included a new request: more automatic weapons. Their reports made specific mention of the folding rifles used by Americans. Not pistols, but fast-firing small rifles that open like tools. It was a mixture of technical observation and sheer disbelief. Back in the field, American soldiers grew attached to the weapon. It had character. The folding stock clacked into place with a metallic snap that echoed through the jungle. It folded like a machine, but fired like a war cry. One paratrooper described it as the rifle that doesn't wait for orders. Some GIs even nicknamed it the clapper, not for its firing sound, but for the distinct sound it made when the stock was snapped into position. That sound became a sign, to Japanese and American soldiers alike, that fighting was seconds away. It was a prelude to chaos. The weapon was also easier to maintain than many Japanese rifles. It used detachable box magazines, was gas-operated, and proved surprisingly resilient to humidity and mud. In contrast, Japanese troops struggled to keep their weapons dry and clean. While they swore by their Arasakas, they began to envy the carbine's practicality. Psychologically, it altered battlefield perception. A Japanese unit under fire from Garans expected a break in the shooting, a reload, a chance to move. But the M1A1 changed that rhythm. Rapid semi-auto fire in quick succession left little room for maneuver. It wasn't just overwhelming, it was unrelenting. Captured Japanese propaganda leaflets began including warnings about folding rifles. The weapon had entered the enemy's imagination. It wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of American ingenuity, a sign that the war wasn't going to be fought the way they expected. In debriefings, U.S. officers noted an unusual pattern. Japanese troops began breaking faster when facing airborne units, not because of numbers, but because of association. They see the folding stock, they break early. They've learned what it means, and they don't want to be here when it opens. By the time the campaign shifted to Luzon, the folding M1A1 was no longer a curiosity. It was a legend. It arrived silently, opened violently, and left no survivors. The Japanese had names for American planes, tanks, and ships, but now they had a name for a rifle, and they feared it more than the rest.
By early 1945, what began as a specialized weapon for paratroopers had become one of the most feared infantry rifles in the Pacific Theater. The M1A1 Carbine, with its folding stock and compact frame, wasn't just a tool of war. It was a symbol of everything the Japanese weren't prepared for: speed, surprise, and adaptability. And even as Japanese command tried to adjust, it was already too late. In the ruins of Ormoc, Japanese prisoners described hearing the clap of the stock unfolding just before firefights erupted. That metallic snap, followed by short bursts of fire, had conditioned entire units into panic. Some units reportedly abandoned positions the moment they identified the distinct sound, believing an airborne assault was imminent, even when none came. For the Americans, the weapon was more than functional. It was intimate. Soldiers cleaned it, customized their slings, etched names into the butt plate. Unlike the bulkier M1 Garand or unwieldy BAR, the M1A1 went everywhere with them. Through rivers, caves, and rice fields, it was always close, always ready. At Luzon, reports emerged of Japanese units surrendering early when they identified paratrooper units equipped with the folding carbine. They feared the squads, not the tanks, one American officer said. They feared the rifle. It was not just the casualties, it was how fast they came, how suddenly it was over. The psychological warfare was unintentional but effective. A weapon designed to fit in an aircraft now lived in the nightmares of ground troops. When captured Japanese letters were translated, multiple soldiers referenced rifles that open like knives and Americans who arrive without sound but shoot without mercy. By the final month of the campaign, American forces found themselves facing less resistance, not because the Japanese lacked men, but because they lacked the will. The folding stock had become a trigger of retreat. The jungle wasn't theirs anymore. It had shifted sides. After the war, Japanese weapons researchers formally studied the M1A1 Carbine and submitted reports noting its balance, field reliability, and shock value. It was short but not weak, lightweight but not fragile, fast but not reckless. In every way, it was the opposite of the doctrine it had dismantled. The legacy of the M1A1 wasn't just technical, it was personal. For every soldier who carried one, it meant getting there first, shooting faster, surviving longer. For those who faced it, it meant losing before the fight even started. This wasn't the rifle that ended the war, but for Japan's officers in the jungle, it was the one that made them realize they were losing it.